Advaita Vedanta. Advaita means not to. Vedanta means the end of the Vedas, which means the end of the teachings. Or it could be just the end of language, the end of verbal communication. The end of words. The end of sound. When you first begin with your Advaita Vedanta, frequently you are told, be the witness. I'm witnessing, just witnessing. I'm not involved with the manifestation. The crisis in consciousness is the fact that the witness has come to believe, or the self has come to believe, that it is divorced from itself, that it is separated from itself. It's traumatic for the self to feel that. So we begin by saying, frequently, Advaita Vedanta teachers begin by saying, first of all, you're just the witness, you're not what is witnessed. So you start off with this teaching, and it can feel like splitting hairs. Because you have to watch each and every moment and say, I see it, I'm the witness of it, it's not me. I see it, I'm the witness of it, it's not me. And it can be quite a disciplined practice. So effort's involved. Very serious effort, very steady effort, frequently. Maharaj said, your mind has to be so focused that it's like somebody's pointing a gun to your face. And it's that serious, where you have to be right there. So this is a serious thing. And even after somebody knows the self, that they have the experience of enlightenment, they may still have some elements of the personality that are clinging on, that are not quite sure if they want to be a person or if they want to be the self. The self has to decide that it wants to be the self, and it doesn't want anything to do with the person anymore. So we're talking about cause and effect. First of all, there is no cause and effect. But if you were talking about it from a phenomenological perspective, i.e. from the way that the mind thinks, in a linear sense, in Buddhism, you could say, in order for there to be enlightenment, first the self has to decide that it no longer wants to be identified as a person. And it has to be so sick of being identified as a person and so fed up with it and in so much pain that it has to say, I am the self only, nothing else. And in that moment, then there's a full detachment where the self is no longer bound by any element, and that's Vedanta, and that's the second half of the teaching. So it's almost like first I'm all one, and then I realize I'm one with everything. Then I realize I'm not any of it. Then I realize I'm all of it. But that I'm not bound by anything in particular that can be formed into a word, and that's Vedanta, the end of language. In the scriptures, the beginning of one of the Vedic scriptures is something like, all knowledge is bondage, bondage is sound, so all sound is bondage, and it's pointing to this thing of language. Our brains get caught up in language and the description of something to such an extent that we get lost in the words and the experience of the word and what it has to tell us about the phenomenological experience that we're having. So, how do you get free? The self has to choose it. And from a deep point, the self has to say, I'm sick of this and I'm done with this. And so usually some sort of crisis is involved. For the Buddha, it was the crisis of seeing sickness and death and saying, how can that be? How does that work? I grew up in this, the Buddha, Siddhartha, grew up in this beautiful world, goes out into the world of peasants and sees the sickness of everyone and says, well, how does that factor into that? So then that splinter in his mind forms where it's like, all right, I guess the world isn't perfect. And so there's this duality then that forms where you have the push and pull, sort of like the imperfect world and then the perfect world, and how to make the imperfect into the perfect. And suddenly you have the Dharma, and suddenly you have the sadhana, the path to perfection. But it's tricky stuff. And I just want to say that the reason that bad things happen is so that the self can realize that it's not that. The self has to get sick of something, really fed up with something, and disgusted. And that's why the world can be so miserable, and that's why terrible things seem to happen to good people. Because the good person is a right soul, so to say. So if you're going through something horrible, keep that in mind. It's happening to you because you're waking up from the dream. And in order to wake up from the dream, you have to have a nightmare. Peace.